Hi everyone, I'm Rob Shapiro from Fitchburg State University, and this is the BACB's 5th edition task list item G-18, use group contingencies. So what is a group contingency? Well, in a group contingency, a common consequence is contingent on the behavior of one member of the group, the behavior of part of the group, or the behavior of everyone in the group. And there are 3 types of group contingencies. There are independent, dependent, and interdependent group contingencies. We're going to talk about all 3 of them. There are a number of benefits of using a group contingency arrangement. The first one is that we can save time during administration by having multiple people that are all basically being exposed to the same contingencies. It can just make it easier for us to be able to implement. It can be more efficient. Secondly, we can use group contingencies when individual contingencies may be impractical. There may be too many members of a group for each one to have an individual contingency in place, and it just may give us a certain economy of scale to be able to use group contingencies. We can use group contingencies when we want to change behavior quickly, in particular behavior of multiple members of a group. Group contingencies also have the benefit of being able to capitalize on peer influence, as we'll see in particular with dependent and interdependent group contingencies. And group contingencies can facilitate positive social interactions because you have multiple people who all have the same contingencies in place, and in some cases may be relying on each other to be able to engage in a certain level of expected behavior in order for the group to contact reinforcement. So looking at each of those types of group contingencies, first we'll examine the independent group contingency. In an independent group contingency, a contingency is presented to all members of a group, but reinforcement is delivered only to those members who meet the outlined criterion. So reinforcement for each member of the group is independent from the performance of any other member of the group. So if we think about an example of an independent group contingency, maybe we have a classroom, and there's the expectation that the classroom, each member of the classroom completes a math worksheet during some silent work time. Okay, we could have an independent group contingency that says anyone who's able to complete the math worksheet by the end of the class will be able to have an extra 5 minutes of recess. Okay? When the class is over, whoever has completed the worksheet gets the extra 5 minutes of recess. Anyone who hasn't completed the worksheet doesn't get the extra 5 minutes of recess. This is an independent group contingency because all members of the group are exposed to the same contingency, but each member's individual behavior determines whether that member gains access to the reinforcement. We can contrast this with a dependent group contingency. In a dependent group contingency, a contingency is presented to all members of the group, but reinforcement is delivered to the entire group dependent on the performance of an individual person or small group within the larger group. Thus, reinforcement for each member of the group is dependent on the performance of that member or those members of the group. So taking the same example that we were just talking about, let's say that instead of it being if you finish the worksheet, you get an extra 5 minutes of recess. And now let's say the teacher has a class where in general it's no big deal. People are ending up able to complete their worksheet. But there's one particular table of students that sit in the classroom that tend to goof off a little bit and not get their worksheets done during independent time. So now let's say that what the teacher says is, hey everyone, we're all going to get 5 extra minutes of recess if everyone at this table gets their math worksheet done. Okay? Now it doesn't matter what anybody else in the room does. They can all finish their worksheets or they cannot. But everybody at that one table has to complete their worksheets for the class to get the extra 5 minutes of recess. So the contingency for the entire group is dependent on that subset of the group getting their worksheet done. Okay, so that's why it's a dependent group contingency. And we can see where this can result in something called the hero procedure, where if that table gets their work done, they're heroes for the rest of the class, right? Everyone else is like, yes, you got it done, and now we get an extra 5 minutes of recess. But we have to be careful because it can also result in scapegoating. What happens if that table, if one member or a couple of members of that table don't get their worksheet done? Now the entire class loses out on those 5 extra minutes of recess. You can understand how that could create some animosity towards members of that smaller group. And then finally, we've got interdependent group contingencies. And this is where a contingency is presented to all members of a group, and all members of the group must meet the criterion for any member to contact reinforcement. Thus, reinforcement for each member of the group is interdependent on the performance of all members of the group. So if we think about an example of this, so with our extra 5 minutes of recess, now let's say that what the teacher says is, here's the deal. We've got this math worksheet. If everybody gets the math worksheet done by the end of class, we all get an extra 5 minutes of recess. But if anyone doesn't get the math worksheet done by the end of class, nobody gets the extra 5 minutes of recess. This is an interdependent group contingency because the behavior of all members of the group determines whether any member of the group is able to contact reinforcement. And using this kind of a system can capitalize on peer pressure and group cohesiveness because obviously there's a real premium on everyone meeting criteria, right? And so there's the likelihood for some members of the group to put pressure on the potential stragglers to make sure they meet criterion so that everyone can contact reinforcement. And there are a couple of ways that we can do this. We can use an interdependent group contingency that is total group meets criterion, which is once the entire group meets some set criterion, reinforcement is delivered. So if we wanted to do it that way, we could look at a situation where the teacher said, here's the deal, we've got this math worksheet to do. Once everybody's done, we get to go out for recess. But until everybody's done, nobody gets to go out for recess, okay? Or we could do group averaging, which would say that if the average student performance meets some set criterion, reinforcement is delivered. So let's say the teacher's looking to back off a little bit on everybody having to finish the entire math worksheet. Let's say there are 10 questions on the math worksheet. The teacher could say, listen, if the average completion is 90%, on the worksheet across the entire class, we'll all get an extra 5 minutes of recess, right? Now this allows for an example, if you've got 20 students in the class, for 10 of them to complete the entire worksheet and the other 10 to only complete 8 out of the 10 questions, because that would average out to 90% and everybody gets recess. So we can use the interdependent group contingencies in either of these ways, total group meets criterion or group averaging. And finally, just some guidelines for how we would go about implementing a group contingency, regardless of which type of group contingency we wanted to implement. Number one, it's important to choose an effective reward. It's got to be something that people want to earn, that's going to be valuable to people if we expect them to work for it. We need to determine the behavior that is to be changed. And then we want to set appropriate performance criteria. So this is really important. We want to avoid, in any situation where reinforcement is potentially available, we want to avoid any kind of a situation where we set the criteria so high that it's virtually impossible for the group to achieve it. Or on the flip side, set it so low that it's really easy to be achieved, so it's almost no work. And students would, or participants would meet that criterion regardless. Next, we may want to combine it with other procedures as appropriate. It may be worthwhile to have instructions or rules or prompting. It may also be appropriate for some members of the group to have some individual contingencies that are layered on top of the group contingency. Next, we want to select the most appropriate group contingency, really determine whether an independent, dependent, or interdependent is most likely to impact the kind of behavior change that we're looking for. And then finally, as with any behavior change procedure, we're going to want to monitor performance to see if our procedure is working. With group contingencies, though, we want to monitor both individual and group performance. So is our group as a whole behaving the way that we would expect? Is behavior moving in the right direction? But then are individual members of that group moving in the right direction? Or do we have a situation where the group as a whole is doing well, but we still have some people that are being left behind by our procedure?